We will just start in one moment. People are still joining us online. Okay, good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this morning's event on eco-social industrializations, lessons from past and current economies. My name is Danielle Brady, and I'm a senior policy analyst at the European Policy Centre, and I'm delighted to be moderating this morning's policy dialogue. This policy dialogue is part of the ToBe project, which is a Horizon-funded project led by the University of Tampere. And it will explore post-growth and long-term focused approaches to policymaking in the context of historical and contemporary cases of industrial policies, with a strong emphasis on social and ecological aspects. I'm delighted to be joined this morning by a wonderful panel of speakers who will provide their insights and perspectives on the various topics that we will discuss this morning. So first of all, allow me to introduce Aleksandar Matković from the Institute for Political Ecology in Croatia, Igor Feketija, who's the State Secretary in the Ministry of Labour, Family, Social Affairs and Equal Opportunities in the Slovenian government, Peter Glenday, Programme and Research Director at the School of International Futures, Robert Morgan, Head of Sustainable Development, the Welsh Government, and Gwi-Yeop, who's Regional Director for Europe and Central Asia in the United Nations. So very much looking forward to hearing all of your insights and inputs during the course of the next 2 hours. I'll give you a brief overview of how we will set up this morning's discussion. We'll first begin by looking back and we'll have a presentation from Aleksandar, who hopefully you can see his presentation on the screen already. We'll then pass the floor to the State Secretary, Igor Feketija, who will give his response to the presentation, and we'll also have a brief opportunity for some questions as well. We'll then move on to what is the second part of this event, looking forward, and we'll hear about the upcoming UN Summit of the Future, which is happening later this month, as well as looking at some ongoing work being done in Wales with the implementation of the Future Generations Act, and also looking at how we can move from discussions and discourse around long-term policy making into actionable governance. So that's how we'll set up, and then we'll also have an opportunity for members of the audience, participants, to come in with their questions at the end as well. So I ask you to already have that in mind, and you can put your questions through the Q&A box, which you will see on your screen. So I think that's enough for me from now, and I'll now hand you over to Aleksandar for his presentation. Aleksandar, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Danielle. So basically, my name is Aleksandar. I come from the Institute for Political Ecology. You already heard a little bit about the project and the background where we all come from. And basically, the idea has been for us within this task 1.2 to work on a little bit on the understanding of transformation, social transformation, and changing mindsets. That's basically the official title. And so we, within this task 1.2, my colleague Moderator, who is also here, has been working on going beyond the so-called sociocentric theories of social change, which means that we kind of have to understand the interactions between the environmental and social actors should we want to explain historical social change, and in my case, planning for the future. So with that being said, I won't bore you too much with too much introduction or the slides. I've been working on Yugoslavia as a forgotten case study of an attempted and failed green transition within the European kind of territorial and economic space. And why this is important, because it was not only simply like a command economy like the Soviet Union, but it was also had some market elements. So just like introduction that makes it important to study, so that today we might learn something from that. So just like a small sort of introduction into what we're actually talking about here. So by the 1980s, according to a CIA fact book, Yugoslavia had a population of about 22,006,689,000 people, and its economy was estimated in the range of $66 billion. Like US $90-$80, and basically its industry composed mostly with a focus on metallurgy, machinery and equipment manufacturing, oils, chemicals, and basically the mining and manufacturing contributed to 27% of the GDP, while actually the majority of the working population was employed in agriculture, 29%. So like this is just to give you some sort of a brief background. And one of the reasons why Yugoslavia is also interesting is because it had actually one of the highest levels of growth after the Second World War. Basically, it around averaged between 1957 and 1960, the growth of GNP, like the gross national product, averaged about 11.3%, which actually was second only to Japan. So from that, and even in some cases, industry and construction, the growth rates were about 14%, which makes it kind of unique because it reached what's known as the limits to growth basically by the 1960s and the mid-1960s and 70s. And what's interesting is that today in the European Union and basically in these policy circles around post-growth, there's a lot of discussion going on how post-growth planning could look like. It needs to be, as Matthias Schnelze, one researcher, put it, a democratically arranged downscaling of production and consumption. And so a lot of researchers have been working as a way to conceptualize how this democratically planned downscaling of production and consumption can take place, because obviously we cannot wish this into realization just by that. So my task was to look at how Yugoslavia went about this. And what I found interesting is basically that there were a lot of discussion in something called the Yugoslav Social Planning Institutes, which I'm going to brief you on a little bit shortly now. There were a lot of discussions on transitioning to a sort of, I would not say post-growth economy, but they used zero growth, and they used this the idea of ecological equilibrium. Even Edward Kardelj, the Slovenian, like the number two person after Tito, was actually involved in these discussions, and a lot of these institutes basically had the task of coordinating and synchronizing interests with various economic bodies within society, banks, enterprises, trade unions. So, for example, the Social Planning Institute in Ljubljana, the one where I did the majority of this research, was basically coordinating more than 111 social bodies, basically. So that's also one of the lessons. Instead of a goal-setting bodies, as was done in the Soviet Union, the state, including the planning institutes, was actually functioning more as a harmonizing body between different interests. Of course, there was a lot of inequality in the sense of what these interests were. It's not the same coordinating the development plans of a certain oil company and the development plans for a trade union, obviously. But what I think we can learn from is that there actually existed institutions which were tasked specifically with analyzing different planning procedures within the societal body. So if a trade union and if an enterprise or a citizens group would have had like a development plan, these institutes were tasked with actually harmonizing these plans and fitting them into socially agreed objectives on a long-term basis. And one of the first plans, actually the only long-term plan that Yugoslavia had, and Slovenia as well, was called Slovenia 2000, and it envisaged the development and transition of Slovenia from an extensive industrialized country from 1985 to the 2000s into a sort of more, as they say, qualitative growth sort of country, and with an emphasis on transition into higher value-added production. And basically the entire idea behind this long-term development plan was they had several objectives. One was to reduce the number of working hours in the country. The other one was to develop the country so as to be on an equal footing with developed countries. but also to make this sort of a green transition that should have established the conditions for a reduction of growth after the 2000s. And basically it went into a sort of post-growth economy. And what's very interesting, I'm going to now turn to the slides. Don't have too much time, so I can only show you some data. So these are some data relating to Slovenia. You know, like we can ask, of course, like whether this was all just like some sort of wishful thinking or not. But to some extent, Slovenia did attempt to achieve a relative decoupling in the services sector, basically. So if we look at residential housing, it continued to grow despite stagnating GDP per capita. And basically, the country also entered into a crisis, which I will briefly touch upon in the end of my lecture. But it's very interesting that despite all of these crises, it fared better than some of the other countries today, basically. So we have space per capita increasing, the number of medics increasing. Also, Slovenia managed to keep basically almost like a full employment during this period. And if you look at several of these indicators, you can suggest that at least in the services sector and public provisioning, there was an absolute decoupling from GDP growth, which means that there is something within this model that that succeeded to function. And so this is where I want to get into a little bit of details before finishing up. So the long-term plan called Slovenia 2000 was basically done and conceived within a sort of a crisis period. So, you know, before that you had the Volcker shock, so basically all of the debts of peripheral countries in US dollars, denominated in US dollars, would have been, you know, rising sky high. So that meant the debt heavier. You have the end of the Bretton Woods previously. Of course, as a precondition to that, you had the oil crisis, which increased the prices of raw materials inputs, which also Yugoslavia needed in order to get this green transition going. Basically, if you want to make an investment into nuclear energy, into hydropower, which was characteristic of Yugoslavia, you do need additional investments and you do need additional raw materials inputs, which actually the prices of them, like at least in oil and other commodities, increased, making the green transition almost impossible. And you know, we can also go back in time and say that even the balance of payments was a problem because in peripheral countries which were previously exploited for their raw materials, they have actually a worse starting position in the sense that, you know, they have accumulated debts and whatnot in comparison to core countries. So, you know, there was some after the Stockholm conference. I don't know if you're acquainted with this, but in 1972, the limits to growth and the Stockholm conference were the key pivotal moment in environmental protection, at which Yugoslavia played a role. And afterwards, in response to this conference, they have changed their planning so as to plan for the development of the periphery in a more environmental friendly way, which was something that I attempted to show here with the Slovenian case. But there was also another thing that is some of the core countries were discussing giving credits and aid to Yugoslavia to develop their green transition, but this also led to, as today is also leading to some of the problems, like the credits not going where they were supposed to go. Basically, Germany was investing in coal industries in Yugoslavia instead of like green industries, and there was also some debates coming, you know, from these core and peripheral relations, which made the green transition of a peripheral country like Yugoslavia all the more heavier and all the more like complex. So I think that this green transition could not have occurred due to some external factors and also some internal ones, such as the completely unequal energy infrastructure in Yugoslavia, which was never unified. So if you go from Serbia, for example, to Slovenia, you basically would have to change trains, you would have to change, you know, the amount of electricity currents were different. So all of that leads us back to, you know, the need for planning, for a unified planning. And I think despite all of these difficulties that Yugoslavia as a country has been facing, and apparently the crisis that never reached out of the crisis, and basically all of the post-Yugoslav countries we face today, perhaps with the exception of Slovenia, face some of the same difficulties Serbia is facing, is still high unemployment, relying on foreign direct investments, and kind of never managed to break through this peripheral stage of development where it was supposed to, invest in new technologies and this, green transition in order to decouple. So I think there was a missed opportunity back then, definitely. But I do think that some of the institutional infrastructure can be definitely used. So such as these social planning institutes, which were every basically major town had them, and they were, as I said, tasked with coordinating different bodies so as to achieve a social goal. So I think the institutional structure might be interesting. And for the end, I want to also criticize a bit like this, the Yugoslav setting, because it's kind of similar to ours. There were movements, ecological movements, especially in Slovenia, which were criticizing these plans. And basically the idea why they criticize them is that Slovenia had invested into dirty industry in Kosovo and Bosnia. The Slovenian banks basically invested into coal production in Kosovo, using also cheap labor for the long-term planning. So this gets us back to the idea that this sort of growth, that this sort of fast growth actually can produce also something that Dusan Plut, this is the book, one of the ecological activists, criticized these long-term plans. He and the people around this book criticized the long-term plans for ecological imperialism towards Kosovo and Bosnia, so like the less developed republics. I think something that also kind of rings a bell with the contemporary moment. And so even in this planning context, this sort of ecological imperialisms can occur. They were noted by contemporaries. And what's I think kind of a lesson there is that a downscaling the production and consumption must be done also at the expense of the core industries within these developed republics. And of course, there are some interests to take into account there. But I think the institutional infrastructure, such as these social planning institutes, might at least come in handy should we want to go down this road, definitely. And I think that's one of the lessons I wanted to put forward here. And okay, I can continue on during the discussion since I've been talking too long for now, but thank you for listening.
Thank you very, very much, Aleksandar, for that presentation and for giving us your insights into the research you've been conducting in this area and the ToBe project as well. And I'm sure we'll come back to a lot of what was touched upon later on in the discussion as well. But I'm now going to hand the floor to the State Secretary from the Ministry of Labour, Family, Social Affairs and Equal Opportunities in the Slovenian government to get your response to the presentation, to get your thoughts on the analysis that were presented there, and also perhaps to get an insight into how past experience have shaped the way in which Slovenia and the Slovenian government now operates.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you to Mr. Matković for his analysis that could not have come at a better time, or maybe is, as he already pointed out, long overdue. It just happens by perhaps coincidence that I was involved about 2 years ago in the research, albeit it was a part of an artistic project, but still I provided the economic research on the Yugoslav project of building the Adriatic highway, so the road along the Adriatic coast in the early 1960s, late 50s, and the development of tourism along that road. And a lot of similar conclusions and points were reached in that research. Maybe just to start off, the absence of Yugoslav planning or Yugoslav project, if we call it that, this idea of a different social, economic, political arrangement is, as Aleksandar pointed out, quite absent from the current literature. And maybe that could be, that is a result of what happened ultimately to Yugoslavia in the 1990s, or also some atrocities happening before that. So a country that produced events like the Tsazin uprising or some political prisons, and of course the genocidal slaughtering in the 90s, lost its actual legitimacy, but with it a lot of the very valuable lessons were lost as well. So maybe one specific example that I recognize here of the difference between the Yugoslav approach and the current approach is development of residential housing. Neighborhoods from Yugoslav times in Slovenia are carefully planned. There is, in addition to the high-rise buildings, there are green areas, there are playgrounds, there is a kindergarten. Previously, one also needed a post office, a store, and a pharmacy. And this is how the older residential neighborhoods look like. The newer ones, which are left entirely to the market, are often dubbed luxury developments or super standard, above standard developments, lack all that infrastructure. Moreover, competition is left to the municipalities, so local governments, in terms of who will attract such residential developments, and then they compete by offering either subsidies or reliefs on utilities development contributions. So as a result, you get a very luxurious residential building with zero appertaining infrastructure and sometimes even underdeveloped utilities, which then affects the very quality of living there. So juxtaposing these two approaches is maybe one example where we could learn how valuable the Yugoslav approach to planning was. And the second one was the second example here would be the approach to planning of tourist infrastructure along the Adriatic coast. Initially, there was, and it started very early, like even in the, I think it was 1958 when the spatial plan for the Makarska coastal region was developed. It was specifically said how space should be used, how tourism should be developed in concentrated centers in order to leave the rest of the coast intact, pristine. And so there was a strong sense of sustainability ingrained in planning that. And then after roughly 1970, when market principles started to be introduced into Yugoslav economy, this was left to private initiative. And as a result, the entire coast was basically cast in concrete, unplanned developments, each man to himself, everybody developed their own weekend houses and so on. So again, juxtaposing two different approaches. So this, again, the lessons are very valuable, but they have been overlooked for a long time. So a really timely research by Mr. Matković. Also, we are, I believe, often focusing on the environmental aspects of planning and development. Of course, yes, the climate crisis is already something we are experiencing. It's not only pending, but I would say equally important is the social crisis, the crisis in terms of inequality, different directions of development. Even within developed societies, we see that. We also see, I would say, a deterioration in the conditions of work, which which can actually be measured in terms of absenteeism, because of both physical trauma and in recent times, especially mental health trauma. I believe there's a research from Spain indicating that the annual cost to the Spanish economy because of mental health problems directly related to working place conditions are in the ballpark of 5 to 6 billion euros. So this is, again, something that has to be taken account. And maybe the last point made by Mr. Matković about outsourcing the dirty parts to other countries is also a lesson in that direction. So yes, we can have green development, but this means that we are outsourcing the dirty parts, and I mean dirty in environmental terms, but also in social terms, in terms of labor conditions, then not much has really been achieved. And also another point here, which may be self-evident, but still, this is not something that can be decided on by one single country. Such approach has to be taken in a much wider context. Now, European Union is uniquely positioned to adopt such decisions, at least on the pan-European level, but even that in terms of environment would not be enough because sadly the greenhouse emissions are oblivious to any political borders, and they will spread. And we actually see that in the energy sector. One country decides to go green, but then when there are deficits in the electricity output, they will actually supplement them with basically dirty coal power from the neighboring countries within or outside the EU. So the lessons are there. We certainly are aware of them, but adopting such an approach involves such a large large group of stakeholders that it is beyond one government's decision to actually do that. It takes a while and a change in the approach or mode of thinking of several stakeholders, as I mentioned, to introduce that. I believe the current government in Slovenia has taken some steps in that direction. Firstly, by actually reviving the public housing plan and public housing effort, after 30 years being dead. We actually saw a graph in Mr. Matković's presentation in the rise of residential capacity. Public housing projects actually stopped in the early 90s. It was all left to the market, and we now have a situation where public housing, residential property is actually apparently one of the most viable forms of investment for those with access to financial assets, rendering real estate so expensive that people entering the labor market cannot afford real estate. So this is one example where long-term planning, and which involved both decent spatial planning, responsible and sustainable spatial planning, as well as some social awareness can come in. And secondly, we're also trying to encourage a certain model of employee ownership within companies, also building on the experience of well, mostly British and American companies where this has been a practice for a very long time, in which where we see that companies with established employee ownership take more responsible, more sustainable decisions, because employees have a different set of interests when talking about the company's development than some absent outside owners who are mostly interested in dividends and capital appreciation. So these are actually the two branches of the newly founded Ministry of Solidarity-Based Future. That is the name selected for this new ministry. The third one is providing long-term elderly care, but maybe not directly related to this. But the first two are definitely along these lines. So spurring economic democracy in order to make more sustainable, more responsible future, and developing residential housing. And in developing residential houses, the experience from Yugoslavia will definitely be taken into account. And maybe also just to touch upon the very viability of the Yugoslav decision-making model. It is true that Yugoslavia, as again Mr. Matković pointed out, was a bit of an economic miracle in the post-World War II period. Then that growth kind of subsided towards the late 60s, stalled in the 70s, and then collapsed in the 80s, roughly. Now, on the one hand, this could be interpreted, and it often is interpreted, as a failure of the Yugoslav system. On the other hand, Yugoslavia was a rapidly developing, industrializing country, also heavily dependent on its Western counterparts for its further development, all of whom in the early 70s also experienced deep, heavy economic crisis. We maybe forget in Yugoslav times there was rationing of gasoline, and people would get actually coupons to buy gasoline. The same thing was happening in the US at the time, right? So I think the jury should still be out in terms of whether that model was entirely unsustainable by itself and should be just relegated to history, or as this paper points out, and I believe this event today, it should be looked to as a legitimate project that merits careful consideration and lessons, and offers some lessons that should be taken really seriously. I'll maybe stop at this point and continue discussion if there are any further questions. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much. And I can see we already have some questions coming in. So I would encourage, we have a brief opportunity now for some questions. So I would encourage participants to put their questions in. And also if any of our panelists have questions they would also like to ask now, and we have some time. The first question that has come into us here is from Stefano Turini. And they've asked, how can the EU change the goal of its economic system in the direction of well-being, in brackets of everyone instead of GDP? And what are these policies? And I might add to that question based on something that you just said about needing, it's a collective, something that needs to be done collectively, and one government can't do it by itself. So how also do we get buy-in for that more long-term approach?
That would be a question for me?
It would indeed, if you're happy to take it.
Okay, yeah, for sure. I mean, I don't want to sound too gloomy here, but in the current state of affairs within the EU, where the interests of specific countries are still very much pronounced and heavily pursued, I don't really see it happening really quickly. Initiatives like this are very important. Raising awareness that this is the right way forward is absolutely important. But we are quite far away from establishing a pan-European central planning body. Maybe that would be a bit of an exaggeration, but still something akin to that would certainly be in place. But again, yes, when I even begin to think about the details of how this body would be composed, how it would be appointed, what kind of rules would it take into account when making any kinds of decision, how binding those decisions would be for particular member countries and so on. For sure, it's a beautiful thought. I would have loved to see it. But given the structure of the European Union and the way it's functioning right now, I'm afraid we're far away from that. But of course, it is definitely a cause worth pursuing in any way possible.
For sure. And I think a lot of these things that are worth pursuing often take a lot of time and a lot of effort. But of course, getting political buy-in from across different jurisdictions will be key. And we might touch a bit more on that coming forward and looking about how we make sure that long-term policy making is also an inclusive thing, that it's not just one part of focus in one part of the world, but indeed focuses on in every region as well. I'm not sure if there are any further questions for the time being. I'm not sure, Aleksandar, if you would like to come in to follow up on anything that has been said in response to your presentation, perhaps?
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to thank Igor. The feedback was important for me. Not only because I think that is a series of kind words, but I do think that kind of the reality around us pushes us into this direction. And also, I'm coming from a political party actually in Serbia called the Green Left Front, and I'm working on an economic policy body where I'm also dealing with how to implement all of these things, And I think one of these things, maybe perhaps I can mention, I'm working currently on something called screening, foreign direct investment screening mechanism, which would allow peripheral countries to control the inflow of FDI, and to control it from the inside should something occur. For example, this is a commission that some European countries have this, Slovenia also does, but this is a body that is attached to some of the ministries, and basically it can scrutinize the investments from within in terms of labor, environmental protection, impact assessment studies, basically credits, raw materials. So it can, scrutinize the entire investment and then decide whether or not we should accept it, reject it, or make some sort of demands, because these investments do need to make a positive contribution to a country. And what I'm working on is to somehow tie it to the local municipalities who received FDI, so they can actually, control it from below, from where it needs to go. And if there are problems like as Serbia is currently facing, like a lithium mine, which will be done in a densely populated area, with a water basin basically to satisfy the needs of the European like EV market. So this is basically, like what's happening right now. And I think, if we do have some of these mechanisms, then we can actually slowly perhaps transition to a planned investment, like strategy, like do we want to be a mining country? Do we want to be an IT country? So basically, I think that we need to go step by step, introducing mechanisms like this, which would then in the future possibly be part of like a larger planning project. And this is something that I'm working on like right now, and hopefully this will be this will also be translated into English, by the way, so I could send you in the future if you want it. This will be a study of 60 pages long and a proposal for the law in the Serbian National Assembly, which I also hope it can be used in other peripheral countries. And I did some detailed studies of Portugal and Romania in like similar import-oriented countries, which can kind of like develop their mechanisms into this sort of direction. So I hope that this might be some like contribution. And apart from that, I forgot to mention some things in the presentation I want to mention now. So these plans, I think the crucial thing I forgot is that these planning institutes and planning procedures were meant as a way to avoid conflicts. So, all these institutes were employing and developing econometric studies and to growth rates in different sectors, industries, and basically developmental models. So they can predict in the next 10 or 20 years which need, basically, if you had growing population, you would need more energy. Where you're going to get this energy is a question. Do you exploit the less developed republics or the less developed countries? Do you transition within your country to some, other forms of industries? So, and then like which industries? So, and I think this sort of planning is going to show, it's not going to negate ecological imperialism, but it will show ecological imperialism before it happens, allowing us to discuss it basically. And I think that points us back to this democratically downsizing and downscaling of production and consumption. So this is where I think literally post-growth and planning, Yugoslav planning need to go hand in hand. I think this is a very important point. And I think also, as Igor mentioned, we do need to change mindsets, definitely. And I just want to tell you an anecdote I found in the archive. There is a lecture by this Yugoslav, the second in charge, Edward Kardelj, where he talks about something called total self-management. It's not something that's widely known, but the idea behind the entire Yugoslav experiment was to create a sort of self-management for the enterprises and also the complete society after 1974. This is basically the only example in the world where you have a country whose ideology and thinking and framework and laws were created so that the citizens can self-organize and to, upscale this on a wider level. And then next step of that would have been, had Yugoslavia continued to exist, the development of total self-management, in the sense not only regulating your workplace but also your environment. So these two go hand in hand. And as Igor mentioned, if they do not go hand in hand, then you will have worker absenteeism, costs of healthcare rising and whatnot. So I literally think we need to go into this direction in the future, definitely. And yes, this will require, basically changing some of these, competitive infrastructure and competitive mindsets that we have been drilled into after, the development of neoliberalism in the 1980s. And I think to also respond to Igor, the death of Yugoslavia mean that this model is bad? Yes, definitely I do not think so. I think the model can be used, today. And as you said, the European Union is actually perfectly positioned to allow, as a confederation of countries to kind of, implement this. And I'm, of course, not a European parliamentary member or whatnot. I do not have that sort of knowledge how this can be translated within the European Union. But I do think it's a very important point, and I do think that what would be needed to be done is undoing much of the almost anti-communism and anti-socialism that has been presenting planning as this sort of a boogeyman or something like that. And as colleagues from Wales will probably know, there are planning procedures being done and developed within the European Union. But I think once we undo all of this like veil of, I don't know what, like veil of negativity, or I don't know what's the word, like a sort of like distance from the Yugoslav planning, history and example, I think then we can perhaps then really learn a bit about how to develop this, not only implement and copy paste it, but actually to take it up and develop it more in the future. And we can discuss that after this meeting. So thank you all for listening.
Thank you very much. And maybe just one further question before we go on to the next section of the event. You talked about changing mindsets and the need to do that. And maybe this is a question to both of you as well, but how do you do that, and how do you communicate the necessity for environmentally focused socioeconomic changes to people, the public, who already feel like they're being economically disadvantaged by measures which are designed to boost sustainability and equity? How do you communicate that what the benefits of these things will be? Because sometimes they're in the long term. How do you bring those people with you? What are the means and perhaps actions that can be undertaken? Igor, perhaps I'll go to you first if you have any thoughts on that, and then to Aleksandar for perhaps 2 minutes each.
Right. So I guess there are two parts to this answer. So one is, how do you communicate the benefits of long-term sustainable planning? That part is easy. You just show the direction where we're going. You show some already negative consequences of our approach, and then you show a different example. The second very important part that was raised in this question is, how do you communicate this to those who have been disadvantaged by the way green transition has happened so far? There is a lot of talk about a fair green transition and a fair digital transition. And again, the lessons are here from 50, 60 years ago, during heavy industrialization. So there is this mantra, or this, we often hear that 50-60% of jobs that existed in the 1960s no longer exist today. So that in the long term, everybody who loses a job in such a transition will be better off. But in the long term, as the famous economist one pointed out, so long term is a misleading term here. It's really important, yes, to make these transitions fair and not to let the burden of these transitions fall on the shoulders of the weakest. But this is, again, happening, right? With the green and digital transitions, the lowest paid laborers are losing their jobs, and there are very few programs, with some respectable exceptions, in place to allow them to survive this transition. Again, a lot of talk about reskilling, upskilling, refocusing, and so on. But in practice, this is, yes, the consequence. So I don't really think that communication is such a problem here, because it's a simple cause to communicate and argue. The real problem is actually making sure that people are not left behind and actually disadvantaged as a result of green transition, which is a positive development. So not communication, but actual actions to support those who are on the losing end of this kind of transition.
Yeah, perhaps I could add up a little bit. I've also been thinking quite a lot, because in Serbia, it's literally what is happening. So there's a mass movement, basically as a consequence of this, like, Scholz coming to sign agreements regarding EVs and whatnot, and also as a consequence of the actions of our government, which have been increasingly worrying. And right now it would be very difficult to communicate anything regarding the green transition, because in Serbia, I think, like on a massive level, okay, apart from circles which are like myself, like researching this, I'm kind of aware of the complexities, but on the wider scale, the green transition is increasingly actually being equated almost with like dictatorship, or like increased like social tensions, as a consequence of like this being a non-communicated, but also, as Igor stated, you cannot communicate something if you don't have something to show for it, like a positive any aspects. And so I think before communicating, we do need to rethink the economic configuration of the green transitions, so it's not to even allow for it to be like a question. And that's gets us back to the drawing board, where I think these sort of planning approaches can be fruitful, definitely, although it's definitely a long-term thing. And coming to that, I think that usually when we thinking about the people involved here, we usually think about the currently existing living people involved here. But I think what actually needs to be kind of reframed a little bit is to think on a long-term social interest on a wider society, including these future generations. So we can, for example, just to make this all concrete, some of the working class professions or some of the industries will be closed in the future. So we will have to think in terms of saving some of the people, for example, giving them training education. For example, coal mining, everybody wants to close it down, so you need to do something with the miners, definitely. So you need to either provide them with educational and training courses or whatnot, but at the same time you do need to have the social interests and in a wider perspective, meaning that some of the industries will have to be downscaled, which means some of the factories would have to be closed down. And so I think perhaps this idea of a long-term social interest can be explained to them. Yes, your job will be jeopardized. We will offer you some sort of training and education compensation for this. I mean, I'm speaking from an ideal and hypothetical perspective, but in the long run, your children and your grandchildren will have to be living in a more just and environmentally safe space, basically. And this is not because we just happen to love nature and love going into the woods, not whatnot. This is because if you do not do that, you will have pollutants, chemicals and whatnot endangering the health of your children, basically. So I mean, as I said, speaking for hypothetically, but these are real challenges we face, and they're not easy challenges, definitely. And we do have to think on a long-term basis and on a long-term planning social sort of basis, and not simply in terms of interest of this corporation, this part of society versus the other part. And this is where planning as a form of avoiding conflicts and reconciliation comes in. So I'll end up with that sort of quote.
Thank you very much. And I think that gives us a nice segue into our next section, where we are talking a bit more about the future, of course. And I think it's also important to say that your presentation as well, and the discussion we have, really does sort of expose the fact that there are lessons that can already be learned from the past about how we should integrate and look towards post-growth and those long-term approaches to policy making. We can see what worked, what didn't work. And it's also important, I think, to reflect before we move forward and look towards the future. But that is what we are going to do now for the next segment of our discussion. And I'm delighted to hand the floor now to Gwi-Yeop from the United Nations. She's the Regional Director for Europe and Central Asia. And focusing on, of course, the upcoming Summit of the Future, which takes place in a matter of weeks now. To get your assessment on what your hopes and expectations for that summit are, and do you think that we will see some substantive progress on better integrating long-term approaches into policymaking? So I'll hand the floor over to you.
So thank you so much for this opportunity, and good morning to all of you, or maybe good afternoon, depending on which time zone you are at. I'm very happy to share some of the key insights for the upcoming Summit of the Future. But before doing that, let me say a few words about the organization that I come from. I represent the Development Coordination Office, which was established in 2019 as a part of the development system reform of the SG. So the whole intent was to ensure that the UN development system is much more coordinated and coherent. And there was a major change as a part of this reform, which was that the resident coordinators who represent the development system of the UN will be appointed directly by the Secretary General. So they are equivalent to ambassadors, sort of, but they are responsible for coordinating all the development operational activities on the ground. And we have more than 135 resident coordinators across the world, and they represent the SG and they represent the UN development system. So they are there to ensure that the UN country team members, whether they are UNICEF, UNFPA, UNDP or FAO, to collaborate to deliver collective results in support of the government and the people, particularly the most vulnerable and those left behind. The DCO, the Development Coordination Office, mandate is to support the resident coordinators and the development system of the UN and ensure that we are helping the member states to accelerate the attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals. So as some of you may know, last year we had the SDG Summit. And this year's the Summit of the Future builds on the outcome of the SDG Summit from last year. So next slide. So the Summit of the Future. So why are we organizing this summit? Because I think there's a very clear recognition that our future hangs in the balance. The choices that we make, and I think the previous speakers have actually somewhat touched on this one. Now, maybe the difference between a future breakdown or collapse or a breakthrough to a better world for everyone. So in a deeply interconnected, multipolar, complex, and fast-changing world, we are definitely not keeping pace with the risks or opportunities that are emerging. I mean, opportunity of, for instance, artificial intelligence. Our SG has just issued an op-ed yesterday. I think it was published yesterday or the day before yesterday. And I'm going to quote what he wrote, which I think essentially encapsulates the spirit of the summit. He said, "We cannot create a future for our grandchildren with a system built for our grandparents." And I think that kind of captures the whole spirit of the summit. So the Summit of the Future is a landmark event aimed at restoring global trust, which is completely broken, and reinvigorating multilateral institutions. And this is where the EU and the UN have shared interests and common purpose. It is about how we cooperate and achieve agreed goals, global goals, and to tackle emerging threats and challenges. And so what is the Pact for the Future? It is the main outcome, expected outcome of the summit, which will be an intergovernmentally agreed document when the world leaders gather later this month in September, which I think, Danielle, you mentioned earlier. The Pact for the Future is supposed to be an action-oriented pact for the future that is expected to be adopted in the margins of the Global Assembly. And it has 5 chapters. And the first chapter focuses on sustainable development and financing for development. The second chapter focuses on international peace and security. And the third chapter focuses on science, technology, and innovation and digital cooperation. And the fourth chapter focuses on youth and future generations. And the fifth, the final one, transforming global governance. And it touches on the Security Council reform. And there are human rights and empowerment of women and girls, gender equality, and poverty eradication, which will be cross-cutting throughout the whole 5 chapters. And then there are separate intergovernmental negotiations on 2 documents. One on Global Digital Compact, recognizing that there needs to be much more structured and transparent and equitable access to whole kind of digital area. And then the second document is a declaration on future generations, not necessarily the youth only, but the generations that are not yet born. And so this is when the SG talks about the grandchildren, that's exactly what he's talking about. And these 2 documents will be annexes to the pact. And the negotiations are getting closer to concluding, and all 3 documents need to be agreed in advance of the summit by consensus. I mean, this is an intergovernmental process. So of course, the consensus and the agreement by all the member states is absolutely key. And if agreed by all, it would be formally adopted at the opening segment of the summit on the 22nd of September. And the co-facilitators for the Pact for the Future are Germany and Namibia. And then they shared the last draft, revision 3, with member states on at the end of last month, 27th of August, to be precise. And it contains 60 actions, including, I said earlier, Language and Security Council reform. And it is now under silence procedure with a deadline of the 3rd September. So now I think we are hoping that this Pact for the Future will be adopted, which will lay the foundation for a more inclusive and effective global governance system. So it is about transforming the multilateral governance system to meet the needs and demands of today, but also tomorrow. Next. So the UN has emphasized the importance of inclusive participation by creating platforms for less economically developed countries to share their indigenous knowledge and innovations. And this includes dedicated sessions and panels at the summit, where representatives from LEDCs will be given the space to contribute directly to the global discourse. The UN is also encouraging the use of local languages and culturally relevant frameworks and discussions to ensure that knowledge production is not only inclusive, but also contextually appropriate. And what is critical is the process leading up to the summit. So we have acknowledged, and I think this is absolutely key, the historical and ongoing impacts of neo-colonialism. And we have taken steps to critically examine and reform international policies that perpetuate exploitative practices. And this is why there has been such extensive consultations with diverse multi-stakeholders, particularly with the civil society organizations. So the Nairobi conference, which is mentioned in the slide, is a good example of how we have heard the voices of the youth, those marginalized and those left behind, but of course, those of civil society organizations. And the changes proposed focus on equitable decision-making, including revising trade agreements, resource extraction policies, and I think it was mentioned somewhat by the previous speakers about the need for a true equitable green transition and development programs to ensure they are fair, transparent, and do not disproportionately benefit the global north at the expense of the less economically developed countries. So the UN is also promoting models of sustainable development that prioritize local needs, environmental conservation, and the equitable distribution of resources. And this is observed also in the changes that are proposed in the IFI architecture, the financial institutions such as IMF and the World Bank and EBRD and others, the EIB, which will create a significant impact in the way of distribution of financing and avoiding past practices. So through the inclusive efforts that have been made by the co-chairs, penholders of the Pact for the Future and various other parallel processes, the Pact for the Future is being shaped to reflect all these diverse perspectives. So in a nutshell, the reforming of the institutions aims to ensure fair representations from the global south, especially the perspectives from LDCs and the middle-income countries. Just to highlight that within the UN system, some of these efforts are ongoing, and there are different structures and entities that are responsible to make sure that we are able to advance the voices of those LDCs and the marginalized, particularly of the global south. So, for instance, we have UN Office for South-South and Triangular Cooperation, which plays an important role in leveraging the skills and resources and technical know-how of the countries from the south and being able to share that with the north, or making sure that they are able to share. Similarly, there is also the Office of the Least Developed Countries, landlocked countries, and small island states that also advocate the voices and the vulnerabilities of the seas and the landlocked countries and other kind of vulnerable countries. The next. At the heart of the Summit of the Future is sustainable development. And I think I mentioned that in the beginning. It is about accelerating the SDGs. It recognizes that traditional metrics like GDP, which was also mentioned, are inadequate for capturing the full scope of sustainable development. So by redefining growth to include environmental sustainability and equity, the Summit of the Future aims to mobilize the financial resources necessary to achieve the SDGs. And this includes advocating for reformed international financial system, including, as I mentioned earlier, IFIs that aligns with the current global realities and supports equitable development. So innovating financing mechanisms, such as the public-private partnerships, are key to this vision and ensuring that financial flows are directed towards sustainable outcomes that benefit all. The final version of the Pact for the Future recognizes that growing SDG financing gap and that developing countries are unable to be able to meet the SDGs and invest properly in climate change and food security and more broadly other relevant SDGs. So as an example, 37 out of 69 of the world's poorest countries were either at high risk or already in debt stress. And I think our Secretary General and the DSG often talk about this one. And while also there is 1 in 4 middle-income countries, they are also at high risk of fiscal crisis. So both middle-income countries and LDCs are highly indebted at the moment, and I think partly because of inflation and growing inequities. And this is why our UN Secretary General launched what we call the SDG stimulus plan, which calls for a significant increase in financing for sustainable development. He proposed at least $500 billion per year. This sounds like a lot of money, but it isn't really, if you really look at the gaps in attaining the SDGs, to be delivered through a combination of concession and non-concessional finance in a mutually reinforcing way. So the reforms to the international financial architecture, which are broadly mentioned in the Pact for the Future, are integral to this SDG stimulus. Let's go to the next slide. And I think there was quite a bit of discussion about how we actually transition to green economies. And of course, the core of that discussion is ensuring that there's equity and justice. The North, global North, are of course responsible for the majority of historical emissions, and we recognize that. There is a need to ensure that these nations take on a larger share of the burden in addressing climate change. The Summit of the Future emphasizes the integration of equity, justice, and solidarity into global emission reduction strategies. And this includes ensuring that most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, like small island developing countries and African nations that are not equally sharing the emissions burden, receive the necessary support to build resilience. Mechanisms for reparation and assistance are vital to achieving a fair and just transition to a sustainable future, in line with the principles of global solidarity. So addressing global equity in emission reduction recognizes this proportional responsibility currently in practice and promotes principles of justice and solidarity and proposes new mechanisms. And as you are fully aware, we have COP, Conference of the Parties, every year, and the COP29 will be hosted by Azerbaijan this year in November. And we are really gearing up for COP29 and COP30 in Brazil to ensure that we are able to kind of really integrate the 1.5 degree goal and vision into all the government plans and the strategies and regulatory frameworks. It's a tall order and it is not easy, but we are working really, really hard to support the host governments in the design and formulation and the future implementation of the national determined contributions, which really need to be aligned with 1.5 degree target. So let's go to the next one, which I think is the last slide. The Summit of the Future is not just about addressing the challenges of today, but as I highlighted and underscored throughout the whole presentation, it is about setting the path for a just and sustainable future. The Pact for the Future, the summit's primary outcome document, embodies this vision by committing member states and broader stakeholders to inclusive and equitable governance. And this requires a collective effort from all member states. And of course, the EU has a special role to play in mobilizing all the members of the EU and other stakeholders to collaborate on common goals, ensuring that global governance or multilateral governance is effective and representative. And the long-term success of these initiatives depends on collective, continued commitment to all these principles that ensure the decisions made today benefit future generations. So it is about making sure that our grandchildren are able to live in a safe, secure, peaceful planet. Over to you.
Thank you so much for that very insightful presentation. And I think we'll all be watching with great curiosity and interest in the coming weeks as we come towards the summit and to see what the outcomes are that come out of that. And you mentioned that the summit, of course, is not just to address the challenges of today, but to look forward to the future and future generations. And I think that nicely brings us to Robert Morgan from the Welsh government. And obviously Wales have had for the last 10 years, have had the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which is focused on an integration of a long-term perspective into policymaking. So it'd be great now to hear from you about what your verdict is, what the overall verdict is, and whether formatively legislating long-term wellbeing considerations has a tangible impact on the culture around policymaking, and perhaps also some examples that maybe have surprised you over recent years that you also think maybe are a result of the implementation of this act. So Robert, I'll hand the floor over to you now.
Great, thanks Danielle. Bore da, good morning. I'm Robert Morgan, I'm Head of Sustainable Development in the Welsh Government. Thank you for inviting me to speak briefly about the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. As others have mentioned, this is a really timely conversation. Increasingly, governments around the world and institutions are looking at how we can better embed consideration of future generations within our systems. We've got the Summit of the Future coming up. One of the key texts is, of course, the Declaration on Future Generations, but also at the EU level, the President of the EU Commission has set out an ambition for a commissioner whose responsibilities will include ensuring intergenerational fairness. So this is a very timely point. I just want to provide a bit of context, as not everyone on the call will necessarily know where Wales is or what Wales is. So it's one of the 4 countries of the UK. It has a population of around 3.3 million. The Welsh Government is the devolved administration which governs most of the day-to-day life within Wales. A bit of historical context because it's relevant to parts of this debate. So Wales was one of the first industrial nations in the world. It has a recent history of extractive industries. So famously Welsh coal in particular, but also at various points in recent history, Wales has had the world's largest slate and copper mines. Steelmaking has also long been an industry in South Wales and continues to be. So for much of its recent history, Wales has been a place where wealth has been extracted, and often with it, quite a lot of human and natural health as well. And so this generation of wealth for others has meant that in many parts of Wales, there's a legacy of poverty, persistent health and economic inequality. But on the other hand, we have huge natural resources, sea, we have sun in the south of the Wales, we've got wind. So we've got lots of opportunities in terms of sustainable power in the future. And this is very much shaping policy making in Wales and decisions that are being taken. So this brings me to the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which is a big part of our answer to the challenge of addressing and embedding sustainability in the country. And that's done through creating 7 wellbeing goals, which you can see on the right-hand side of the screen. And I'll explain a little bit more about those later on. The main aim of the Act is to improve social, economic, cultural, and environmental well-being in Wales. And we believe in Wales that these are all interconnected elements, so that they should be viewed through the same lens. And the Act gives people in Wales and public authorities a legally binding aim and a framework to work within to make better decisions. This was also developed in parallel to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So we've used this legislation as a legal mechanism to deliver on those goals at a national level. So why do we need to legislate for this? This is a question I get asked by lots of different countries. Well, we're all aware of the multiple crises we're facing, and that we also need to combat, to some extent, that short-term nature of decision-making in government. So the Act is really an enabling framework, and its legally binding provisions help ensure that we are focused on acting in a more sustainable way. So in terms of how does it work? The Act builds on the UN Brundtland Commission definition from 1987 that sustainable development should meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And when we talk about future generations, we tend to mean people who are not yet born. So it's not just young people, but it's people that are not yet born. And when we're talking about sustainability, we're talking about economic, social, environmental, but also cultural well-being. And so we've made culture that kind of fourth pillar, fourth element of our approach to future generations, which is quite unique. So the Welsh Government has had duties, legal duties, for more than 25 years now, but the 2015 Act, the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, took this much further. It set a legal duty on public sector organisations, including government, so they have to set wellbeing objectives, they have to report on these annually. It's created a system of transparency and a strong tool for the public to judge government performance and public sector performance as well. So there's a lot of information on this slide, but this is the architecture of the Act, which summarises the key elements of the legislation. So at the top of the screen, we have these 7 wellbeing goals. These are the substantive what we are aiming for. We have 3 mechanisms that help us understand our progress, our national indicators, our milestones, and our future trends report. We then have our legal duties. So we have a duty on public bodies, we have a duty on regional institutions and on community councils. We've defined how to work sustainably through the 5 ways of working, which I'll explain a bit more about later. And then we really importantly have key accountability mechanisms. So we've created the world's first Future Generations Commissioner. We have an auditor, and we have our Welsh Parliament, the Senedd Cymru. So firstly, a little bit of information about the 7 wellbeing goals. This is the what we are aiming for. So back in 2014, we had a big national conversation with people across Wales from the public, private, voluntary sectors. And these are the things that matter most to people in Wales: prosperity, ecological resilience, health, equality, cohesive communities, vibrant culture and thriving Welsh language, and a globally responsible Wales. And these are kind of the North Star, I guess, for our policy making. And ministers within Welsh Government and officials doing the day-to-day work must demonstrate how their policy making is maximizing its contribution to these goals. So these are the what, substantively what we're aiming for. In terms of how we reach those goals, we have created a sustainable development principle, which is like the delivery mechanism. So how do you work sustainably? It's about effective collaboration, integrating our efforts, involving people to reflect the diversity of the population that's going to be impacted by what you're planning to do, looking to the long term, and by focusing on the root causes of problems rather than the symptoms, so taking a preventative approach. And together these make up the Sustainable Development Principle. And again, we have a duty to demonstrate that we have applied these 5 ways of working in the development of our policies. So it's not just Welsh Government that's subject to this. There are 56 public authorities. They tend to be the bigger key strategic public institutions, our environmental regulator, health institutions, our big cultural institutions as well. So there's a very widespread, and this has been really helpful for bringing all of these organizations together with a common framework. And I think that sense of all being in a similar position has really helped the debate and conversations around how we can do better. This is the big question about how do you measure well-being, and this enters these debates about growth and GDP. We have 50 national indicators for Wales, which were created under the Act, and these map across to our 7 well-being goals. These are meant to provide a more holistic set of measures on how Wales is doing as a country, how it's progressing, not just using traditional economic measures of societal progress, important as they may be. And each year we publish a Wellbeing of Wales report. So it's an annual report, provides an update on how we're doing against each of these 50 areas. We also have a set of 17 national milestones, and they're effectively telling us where we would like to be against some of these key indicators in the future. And when we talk about future, we're talking about generally 2050. So we're not talking about 3 or 5 years' time. We're talking about much longer horizons. And that has been a big change, kind of shift in mentality as a result of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. I also wanted to touch on a third mechanism we have called the Future Trends Report. And this is about integrating long-term perspectives into policy design. So on the right-hand side of the screen, I've done a screenshot of the infographic for the Future Trends Report, and it provides an overview of the key trends that are likely to impact Wales's well-being in the future. And so part of my role is supporting teams to consider these trends in the development of their policies, how, what you're planning to do today or what you're investing in today, might be around for 30 or 40 years, while the climate will be different in 20 years' time. So, the population will be different, the resources that will be needed, the housing, for example, will be different. So how are you taking that into account, and how are you modifying what you're doing in response? And we have tools, and I'm sure a colleague from SWAF will talk about this, but we have tools to support this work. So we've recently published research on our approach, foresight for sustainable development and wellbeing governance in Wales. So if people are interested in knowing more about that, they can find more information there. So this is an area of active interest, and it's a really important mechanism we have in the Act to make us think about the long-term impact of what we're doing. I want to talk a little bit about the 3 accountability mechanisms we have. As I mentioned, the Act created the world's first Future Generations Commissioner. The current Commissioner's role is to provide support and advice, conduct reviews, make recommendations, publish reports, effectively make sure everyone is following the Act and that we're meeting a good standard. The Auditor General has a more technical role, so he examines whether public authorities have acted in line with the Act, that they've properly set objectives, that they've properly set steps to meet those objectives. So together, these 2 people, these 2 organizations are responsible for making sure that we are up to the standard expected and meeting the spirit of the Act as well. And then thirdly, the accountability mechanism, which is important, is our Welsh Parliament, the Senedd, which has an important role. Members of the Senedd scrutinise our progress under the Act, but we also have a specific committee which is responsible for keeping our progress under review. So as we move towards 10 years of this legislation, one of the questions that I get asked and that the EPC has asked me to reflect on is, what has the law actually changed? I think there are a few key reflections. I think number one, it's shown us the importance of legislation. Law is different from policy. Policy can be changed at short notice. It's the same with strategy. Law has a stronger intention behind it, and it's designed to be there for multiple years. The Act has provided clarity to public authorities and the public at large in Wales, and it's become an enduring reference point. So having future generations at the heart of our policy making has shifted thinking to one that is more conscious and long-term. So it's not saying that government can't make a controversial decision, but it's saying if you are going to do that, you have to think about the long term. You have to think about what impact that's going to have on future generations. So it's making more conscious decisions. And I've noticed that Welsh government strategies are now looking a much longer time span, so 20, 25 years ahead, when it used to be more typical for sort of 5-year planning. Number two, I think adding culture as a pillar of sustainable development alongside environment, society and economy has really helped us reframe the debate in Wales. When we talk about sustainable development, we are immediately thinking of history, heritage, language, identity, and that has been a big shift. Number three, we have been clear about what we want to achieve through our goals, and we have defined how we will get there through the 5 ways of working sustainability. It's really important that we have defined a clear delivery mechanism in that. I think the past 10 years have also shown the importance of creating platforms to share and support good practice. It's shown us the importance of strong independent oversight. It's important that we're not marking our own homework. So through our Commissioner and our Auditor General, we've got a culture of transparency, accountability, but also continuous improvement. That sustainable development is not a destination. It's something that the goalposts keep shifting, so that we have to be more ambitious and we have to be more stretching. It's important as well that we keep thinking about creating spaces for young people's voices to be heard. And I thought it was interesting what we've just heard about the mechanisms that have been put in place to ensure that we have a diverse voices heard. One initiative we have in Wales, led by our Commissioner, is the Future Generations Leadership Academy. So young people from diverse backgrounds come together, they develop skills, they will be the leaders of the future. So it's important that they understand what sustainability and future generations thinking is about. So I put some examples on the screen here. These are just screenshots from the BBC news website. You can see the direct influence of the Act across Welsh policies. One of the key ones was the decision not to go ahead with building part of a motorway in South Wales that was planned to be going through an area of wetland that was very diverse, biodiverse. And the First Minister, when he made the decision not to go ahead with that, said that he could not go ahead with this decision because of the impact that this would have on future generations in terms of the environmental damage. So that was I would say, a milestone key decision. But other commitments, such as keeping oil and gas in the ground in Wales, banning single-use plastics, providing school children with free school meals. We have the second best recycling rates in the world in Wales after Austria. And we're making good progress in terms of more sustainable approaches to transport as well, in terms of the speeds of our road, the number of roads being built, etc. So it's having a really cross-societal impact. And we can see that in terms of the documentation behind a lot of these policies. I think there's a few things in terms of further considerations and challenges. One of those is thinking about how we take a systems approach. We have to look at the systems of government and identify entry points where we can deliver on these commitments. So in Wales, we think about things like corporate planning, financial planning, workforce procurement, our asset management, risk management, but also performance. This is often really slow, transformative work that happens in the background. But for me, it's a reminder that you can't sort of cut and paste a solution. You have to design the conditions for, the creation of lots of different solutions. Secondly, a big challenge and ongoing challenge is changing the culture of the civil service. So the actual people who are delivering on these aims. This is really important to maintain momentum, particularly if political leadership changes. And this is really where the value of networks and communities of practice come in. and we need to be valuing that work. Thirdly, we're all becoming more advanced in terms of measuring sustainability through indicators, and that's great. But I think a challenge we face in Welsh Government and elsewhere is how do we ensure that these statistics actually drive action, that people pay attention to them, and that results in something changing? Do we have a system in place to react if, for example, an indicator is not performing as well as we would hope? And then finally, looking ahead to the UN Summit of the Future later this month, which is possibly, you know, the most important event on future generations governance that's ever taken place. This provides us with an opportunity to reflect on, you know, what we are going to do differently in the months and years ahead. How do we use moments like this to generate real, meaningful change? And if anyone has any questions on any of that, I'm more than happy to discuss those. Diolch yn fawr. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Robert. And we do indeed have some questions for you. But in the interest of time, I think we'll move on and hear from our next speaker, who is Peter, before we then maybe come back to those questions in the Q&A section. But Peter, moving on to you now, and I think Robert very well outlined how Wales is a very good example of how this has been implemented and some of the actual tangible outcomes we can see from the Future Generations Act. I think more broadly, we hear a lot of language around long-term approaches, and I think it's fair to say that this has increased in contemporary political rhetoric. However, perhaps in your presentation, it would be great to know, do you think that this reflects government's actual willingness to tackle long-term problems, or are we suffering from a rhetoric capacity deficit? If this is the case, how can we make that transition from long-termist language to long-termist governance, particularly within the context of equitable, sustainable policymaking? So Peter, I'll hand the floor over to you now.
Thanks, Danielle. And I think we heard in Robert's presentation that language is helpful. It helps people come together, have a shared conversation about what we actually mean about long-term thinking. And at the School of International Futures, I've been working for about 10 years in strategic foresight and kind of aspects of long-term planning along with colleagues. But I think we heard in Robert's presentation that language is a start. Culture is where you're ultimately kind of aiming for. And the Welsh example is a great one where you've helped, where there's been a successful coming together of language, processes, structures, and really embedding this in policy making and the way that the whole culture of the government and society starts to operate. And I think we have seen people waking up to foresight, well-being, language around well-being, future generations, intergenerational fairness, but also kind of language around anti-fragile approaches, complexity, and this is great. This helps develop a shared understanding of the problem and some language to start generating solutions. But there's also risk that it could become performative or co-opted or seen as an agenda that's owned by some but not others. And I think the UN Summit of the Future and the UN has been working really hard to try and make this an inclusive, equitable conversation around the Summit of the Future, which is great. But we did some research a while back on foresight and language and how it's been used in different geographies and different communities. And it was clear that this was working for the International Development Research Centre in Canada. It was clear that language and definitions of foresight really matter, but they're really interpreted differently across regions and communities of practice have also emerged in different ways. So that focus on local culture, history, and finding language and really kind of embedding it in a way that's suitable for the cultures and the different perspectives that exist is really important. And if you look back to 2010, which is when the School of International Futures was founded by our kind of managing director, Kat Tully, and Alan Ruddock, both came out of UK government. We were facing a real uptick in interest in strategic foresight as a potential solution to some of the problems that have been identified around a lack of systemic long-term thinking, a lack of kind of ways to steward system, whole of government, whole of society kind of approaches. And this was driven partly by the global financial crisis. And there's a real hope that that might translate to a change, but it didn't in the way that people hoped. And we think that that was partly due to a lack of accountability and a lack of transparency, and also because things weren't connected into the hopes of citizens, and really that kind of perspective around citizens' voices. And if you contrast where we are to kind of 2010 and that period, we have a kind of more pressing climate crisis. We have a lot of structural inequalities, and we're living in a world where power structures have changed. There's a growing recognition and voice across Africa, Asia, Latin America, non-Western approaches, decolonization agendas, gender-based approaches to things like foreign policy. And there's also much better awareness of kind of things like well-being economics and similar approaches that value natural capital, post-GDP conversations, as well as more tried and tested approaches to engaging in a meaningful way with youth, with citizens, with intergenerational and having intergenerational conversations. So I think as Robert said, and as Gwi-Yeop outlines, this is a real opportunity around some of the future for there to be meaningful change. And we often talk about, sorry, go back to my triangle. Our view is that you need to be really investing in kind of how organizations, sectors, governments, and that includes multilateral system, can work together to navigate uncertain futures. We need to be investing in helping leaders make intergenerationally fair decisions, and we've heard from Robert kind of ways that's been done in Wales. And you need to connect that into citizens' voices to help them have more power and agency over their futures and really think about future generations as well. And so this requires us to enable future and current leaders to change. It requires an approach on both thinking about the current system, thinking about the emergent system, and how do you actually transition? How do you help the current system die a death almost, or kind of leave behind some of the things that are in the past and move into that future? And I think there's some questions in the chat already which talk about some of the issues around incumbents and how do you work with that to make that system change. So we believe in that a lot of this is around enabling future and current leaders to change. Language is important, culture is critical, but helping to build those intergenerational coalitions, helping reform institutions, governance, some of those conversations around some of our future, and also targeting change across multiple levels at the individual, the intervention, and the system level. And some of the ways that we've been trying to do that at SWAF, and I'll talk to these very briefly because I know we're slightly over time. One is by connecting into, through our Next Generation Foresight Practitioners Network, really connecting into the hopes, the ambitions of young change makers, helping them harness and insights about the future and also challenge power dynamics. So helping them connect into conversations where they're typically not heard or not able to participate in. And there's some amazing work being done. And I'd encourage people to look into some of the stories of change that are happening in their communities. And this could be bringing in decolonial approaches to futures work. It can be really thinking about how you rebalance power and equity, or how you connect into networks and drive change in your communities. We also spend quite a lot of time talking about intergenerational fairness, and we developed a framework with Calista Gulbenkian Foundation a while back, which was hoping to try and address some of those questions around accountability and transparency for people who don't have the more formalized structures like you do in Wales. And it has three elements. It has a concept of institutional ownership or institutional stewardship, because we don't like the necessarily ownership language. Concepts of intergenerational national dialogue, and then this concept of policy assessment. So this was about how do you have conversations around intergenerational fairness in a transparent, accountable, and useful way, connecting into the political system, putting potentially pressure in from the outside through public debates, through media, and looking to try and drive change at global standards and in global standards and agreements. And we felt the transparency, accountability, and ownership principles were key to this. So there's a tool that's available if people are interested in applying it. And the idea is that we are asking a systematic way of asking about whether policies are intergenerationally fair. So do they meet the needs of different people at different ages? And do they meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs, which is the kind of the Brundtland definition that Robert talked about. So the idea is it helps you think about, does a policy disadvantage people at any particular life stage, at any particular period in time? the now and the present or the future? Will a policy decision increase the chance of inequality being passed on through time? Or will it restrict the choices of people in the future or move society away from the vision that you have for the future? And that requires an understanding of what people want, their hopes, their fears. It requires an understanding of different futures, different ways that things may play out, and the uncertainties. And it requires an alignment and vision process, and ideally done in a way that connects into citizens' voices. The other thing that I wanted to highlight is in the lead up to the UN Summit of the Future, our team have been looking at different ways that Wales, as well as 32 other countries, have been looking to embed intergenerational fairness and long-term governance principles into societies with a focus on national strategy and government. And the team will be releasing a handbook soon that provides both some technical evidence and the basis of a kind of maturity framework that you can use for assessing and prioritizing actions at a kind of multilateral through to a kind of community level. And it sets out 3 levels of action where we think countries can seize opportunities to implement the declaration and the principles within the declaration. So there's an aspect of action, so providing participating countries with a holistic understanding of long-term governance within their territories and pathways to strengthen it. There's some research to help identify common traits of what works and what doesn't. And we find that the interaction between political leadership, citizens and institutions emerges as crucial across all contexts. And we hope that it supports advocacy in terms of establishing a reference point that will help countries implement the declaration and enable them critically to try and demand accountability and support from the national and multilateral system. And through the work, it's become clear that long-term governance requires this shift in mindsets and expectations from people, governments, institutions. It requires us to kind of look at how we overcome silos in crisis management and to consolidate governance around long-term independent participation, nature-embedded approaches. It's clear that kind of embedding futures methods and foresight, which I'm not going to go into tools today, is also critical for helping civil service, public officials, and others across the executive, legislative, and audit institutions really think about and understand how they can use futures evidence and connect into the needs of future generations and embed it in decision making. And it requires a focus on intergenerational fairness in a way that supports that kind of transparency and accountability and those metrics that Robert talked about earlier. So in it, there'll be some recommendations around building national long-term governance capability, and that includes assessing intergenerational fairness, building coalitions, engaging institutionally, monitoring, fostering accountability. There's some suggestions at the UN level about how to really use that strategic guidance from the UN headquarters when people are implementing and monitoring the declaration and aligning efforts with the 2030 agenda, and how to engage in kind of post-SDG preparations. And then there's some wider suggestions for the multilateral level around advocating for systemic reform, around conversations that are happening internationally, how to advance national interests in global corporations, and how to achieve some of those systemic shifts that we need in development cooperation. So if you're interested in getting a copy, please do reach out. There's a slightly confusing email address, which is sotf@soif.org.uk. And I just wanted to say, just going back to the point around language, I think this is a moment in time, and it's really how we can build on those hopes and expectations around the summit of the future and translate it that's key. And that requires a focus not just on the institutionalization, but also citizens' voices and helping our leaders really understand how to think about the future in a systemic way. And I'll stop there and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Peter, for that presentation. And we now have some time for question and answers. And I already see the Q&A box is filling up, so be sure to get your questions in. Peter, I might actually just follow up with you based on something you said, which also links to a question that we have in the chat box related to long-term planning versus the need for flexibility when you come across changing circumstances, complexity, unexpected crises, and how you manage those divergent focuses, as is put in the question. And you mentioned in your presentation that long-term governance requires a rethink, a shift in thinking about overcoming silos, and that plays a role in crisis management as well. So it'd be good maybe if you just expanded on that a little bit, with the to answer that question, perhaps.
And I think it is a real challenge. There'll be people on the call who are grappling with this, and inside institutions who might be better positioned to answer it. The trends report that Robert mentions, I think there's no shortage of insights around the future and where it might go. The issue is trying to prioritize, trying to commit resources that you have to come up with the best possible outcome, and that requires you to be thinking about the future, to be rehearsing it, and really spending time understanding what are some of the kind of key uncertainties, some of the key disruptions, some of the key changes that might come in and influence us. And by doing that, you can start to say, okay, this is where we need to prioritize in line with, the voices and expectations of our kind of constituencies, and thinking through what we might need to do in place if we see indicators that the world's shifting in a particular direction, and then thinking about kind of what you need to have in place in terms of resilience to respond to some of the known disruptions. And the future is inherently kind of uncertain, but it doesn't mean you can't take steps to do that. And there's a whole range of tools, foresight tools, more traditional planning tools that you can use to do that. I don't want to go into the methods so much as it's a mentality, and it requires some time and effort to actually take steps to do that and see things as really systemic, which I think is really, for me, kind of a great outcome from the Wales work. Things are not disconnected, and looking for those kind of systemic interactions and intervention points can be really helpful.
Thank you very much. And I think, Aleksandar, you might want to come in on this point as well.
Yeah, I've been thinking quite a lot about this point because it's actually quite crucial. I'm not sure about other countries today, but I mean, in Yugoslavia, definitely, the planning procedures were tied actually to domestic investments, And so the way planning works actually is that you do need some sort of surplus product, some sort of like surplus GDP to like feed into future investments. So if you, I mean, the whole point of planning is to, basically envisage sort of society, how you want it to look like, and, trace back your step, to the conditions you have for creating this. And this, in economic terms, does mean more domestic investment. So you do need some sort of growth. So for, even to degrowth in the future, definitely. I know some of the people might, coming from these post-growth circles, might, like have a knee-jerk reaction to this, but, any sort of transition needs to happen from existing resources, definitely. And so the way in Yugoslavia, and I think like the way systemic shocks, and they will occur, should be addressed, is definitely to be clear on what the priorities are and what the details are. So if you want to, give up some sort of aspect of the plan so as to keep investments flowing in another direction, I mean, it needs to be definitely upgraded and, almost on an annual basis. And so what I think also the lessons from the Yugoslav experiment is that these plans were not like set in stone once, like carved in huge letters and that's kind of it. No, they were actually tied to communication. And it was expected from enterprises, the government and planning institutes. They had laws regulating the planning procedures, where basically the idea was that if any one side wants to make a change to the plans, it needs to communicate this to the all sides. And so plans were actually also, like communicated and advanced in all sort of levels of their realization. And of course, they will change, but the idea behind this was, as I said, not to have this like Soviet sort of like planning from top down and like setting things in stone in terms of outputs targets. This is usually actually how we envisage planning, but it's just like one small type of planning, that actually perhaps received the most media attention. But, there are other like forms of planning like this, which actually involved adjusting to existing realities, which I think all planning procedures need to be done. And also that's very interesting is that the long-term plan of Yugoslavia from 1985 to the 2000s begins actually with a description of the crisis and basically offering some sort of ways out of the crisis. And, transitioning back once stability has been achieved in terms of like balance of payments and whatnot, and the debt question was regulated. So and it actually got created in a small time frame within which Yugoslavia had actually these options to do so. So definitely overcoming crises are actually like a precondition for this in terms of, you know, like stabilizing your entire economy so you can actually plan. But there's, you know, going to be some shocks which will endanger the planning itself. So, I mean, if you want to tie planning into domestic investments, then definitely it exposes you to risks, but you need to be, of course, careful about where your priorities lie.
Thank you very much for that. And I think it's a matter of how this shift in thinking then also means a shift in thinking when you do come across these crises, which I think will continue to exist, unfortunately, but it's about how governments and policymakers react to them, and that the right mechanisms are in place to be able to react in such a manner. Robert, I'm going to come back to you as we have a number of questions following your presentation, but perhaps two that I will pull out here is, when discussing with stakeholders, how did Wales interact with the power of business lobbies and did not want that did not want their interests to be reduced? I think this goes back to something we touched on earlier on about how, you know, we need buy-in from everyone. This can't just happen in one section of society, but needs to be a cross society approach. And the other one then is whether, again, about there are often conflicts of interest between growth, market investments, and business on one hand, and well-being of future generations on the other. So those two questions are very much linked. So if I could get your response to those, I know not easy to do it.
Sure.
It's a time, but
so I'll pick up the second question about growth. So the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act doesn't refer to growth, instead refers to prosperity. And so this, I think this is deliberate. And Wales is also a member of the Wellbeing Economy Governments Partnership. So alongside Finland, Iceland, Scotland, New Zealand, and Canada. So we come together as a group, and again, it's a platform for discussing, you know, more holistic measures of wealth, you know, going beyond GDP. So I think on the question of growth, I think it's really a question about if something is being done with the intention of boosting economic growth, the question the Act is really encouraging policymakers to consider is, what kind of growth are you talking about? You know, actually, what are the substantial benefits? What are the potential drawbacks? And so it's asking those kind of more searching questions about what is the nature of the growth that you're, you know, pushing for, or that you see as envisageable. So it's not always straightforward, because you're right, there are some kind of competing elements to this. But I think the Act isn't stopping these decisions going ahead, but it's saying, you know, you have to give consideration to these elements, and you have to demonstrate that you've properly considered them. And so that is the big change. Beforehand, decisions could be made in a much more straightforward way without that thinking having taken place. Now, by law, you have to demonstrate that you've taken those into account. And quite often, if that growth isn't delivering on those 7 well-being goals, then it won't get to the stage where it's approved or recommended for ministers to agree. So that's the key difference, that you won't have seen some of those kind of proposals come to the fore that you may have seen 20 years ago. So I would say that the debate on growth has shifted as a result of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. It's not a debate about post-growth or beyond GDP necessarily, but it's more about how do we supplement those traditional metrics of productivity, GDP, etc., with other things like, for example, the health of the soil, biodiversity, the health of young children, mental well-being. And that's why we have the 50 national well-being indicators, and why we consider those every year in our annual update. So yeah, the kind of debate between growth versus well-being of future generations, actually that debate is sometimes not always as defined as people might expect, and in some areas it's quite artificial, because the growth that we're seeking in Wales is in line with those 7 well-being goals. And then I think the first question was talking about the role of businesses. Is that right? So the Wellbeing and Future Generations Act is primarily for the public sector institutions. So it doesn't place a duty on private sector organisations within Wales. Nevertheless, what we've seen is that a lot of private sector organisations have voluntarily become involved in this work. So we have a national forum, and they're part of that. We have a lot of tools that we use with our private sector colleagues, and they're able to, through those, make a stronger contribution. I think in particular, smaller organizations, smaller private sector or non-profit organizations, in particular, we see a strong push from them to be making a big contribution to the Sustainable Development Goals and the National Wellbeing Goals within Wales. So there is a really strong appetite within the private sector. And instead of seeing this as a burden, this is something that they actually want to be more involved in. And I think for genuine reasons, because they see that the future of their organizations and the long-term prosperity from their organizations comes from working in a more sustainable way. And that looks beyond just short-term gain.
Thank you very much, Robert, for the answer to those questions, which I think was very insightful and kind of gives a greater picture on how Wales is dealing with these things as well, and of course offers examples to other regions who are trying to grapple with similar challenges. Perhaps linked to that, obviously, you mentioned how in considering policies, you have to consider future generations and what implications will be like for them in talking about long-term policy making. We have a question here, and I think Gwi-Yeop, I'll put it to you about the definition of future generations, whether this should or does go beyond people to also include other ecosystems and species, particularly given the rise of the rights of nature and environmental justice movements. So when we talk about future generations and long-term policy making, that are we also talking about or inferring more than just people, but our environments and other species? I'll hand the floor over to you, and then I have a question for Igor as well.
So thank you very much. I think to answer your question, I think the definition is all-encompassing, and therefore it is not just limited to people, because people, we live on planet, and we all want to be prosperous. So I think it's very much interconnected principle that we need to respect. And therefore, when we talk about future generations, it is not just about the people, but actually all the species and the that are part of our world that we live in. So yes, I think it is the simple answer, and I think that's why the Summit of the Future. There's a special declaration on future generations, and it was hugely inspiring for me to hear the presentations from both Robert and other colleagues, including Peter. That there's so much going on, and I almost felt like you're talking about the UN system because the language is so similar, and I was very pleased and that it is not only the developing countries that we mostly work in, and we are working together to discuss these issues, but it is also developed countries such as Wales that have similar approaches who are fully embedding the principles and the approaches and the pact that we are promoting. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your answer to that as well, and also for your previous inputs. I think we've been very lucky with the content that we've been presented this morning. And I think we're going to go back to earlier first section and look at Slovenia. And there's a question here about what is the best avenue to build long-term planning within the EU. So questions of, is the Future Generations Act something that could be possible, or internationally binding pacts? And I suppose also how that links then with the ongoing work in the UN, because obviously EU plays a role in that as well. So Igor, I'll give the floor to you.
Yeah, thanks. For sure, the example of Wales is one example that could be taken as a sort of role model to pursue. The way such regulations or such decisions work at the EU level, is mostly through adoptions of directives. So maybe one such recent example, which we see as a positive development, is the directive on platform work, which is binding for the entire EU and which sets up a rebuttable assumption that labor relation, employment relation actually does exist in case of platform workers. So we actually see that as a major breakthrough, although it might not be so very impactful. But yeah, most of the EU was able to agree that we do have a problem in work relations and that we should address it. And it's being addressed through a binding directive. So by extension, a similar agreement could be reached, perhaps on setting up a framework of alternative indicators. So in order to move beyond GDP and similar outdated indicators. And then probably as the next step would be to set up a EU body. But again, reaching the stage when decisions of this kind of body, which could ultimately maybe prevent a certain investment initiative, would probably be seen as too big of an infringement in the free business initiative, single market, and so on. So yeah, all these aspects should be juxtaposed, and the decision at the EU level should be made that this is the right way forward. But again, this would be a really considerable shift in the mode of thinking, right? From the current free business initiative approach to there is somebody above business who has to at least steer it and somehow correct the negative externalities that business as it is creating. So I guess that would probably be one possible path off the top of my head. So adopting a directive, and then the next step maybe a body, and then trying to agree on having this directive and this body having to have a binding effect on the member states.
Thank you very much. And I think what's two words which are related that I've heard a lot today is shift in thinking, changing mindset, that all of these things are essential to really implement a future-looking policy-making approach. But I think what is very positive is that we can see from the Welsh example that it is possible and that can happen. So I think that's also great to see, and to see how other parts of the world can implement such an approach. And I think it's helpful when you can see outcomes as well. It's easier to, for want of a better word, sell such an approach to government and policymakers. Unfortunately, we've come to the end of our event. I very much enjoyed the discussion, so I want to say a massive thank you to each of our panelists for their input, which has been fantastic. And also massive thank you to our audience members as well, who've provided some wonderful questions for our panelists throughout the discussion. I would invite you to continue to follow our work at the European Policy Centre on such topics, particularly within the context of our project ToBe, which this event was held under, but also our other work that we are conducting around this area. So it just leaves me to say goodbye to you all, and I wish you all a very nice day, and thank you again. Bye now.
Bye-bye. Thank you.